just to be devil's advocate a bit, isn't there an argument to be made that in America in the 19th century, it's pretty hard to see the future of black and white living together. Sometimes hard to see it even today the way it is.
Oh, yeah.
We're doing it, and I think we've made great progress in that regard. But nonetheless, back then, there were a lot of real fears.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, non-fears, amalgamation
Oh, God,
yes.
yes. Oh, yes.
of the
Yeah.
two races and
Yeah.
things like that. But
Yeah.
there were really fears that could the two really live together,
Oh.
and especially through white fears as well
Sure.
of racial war and
Sure.
revenge and things like that. So colonization, in a way, we look down on it, and I
Yeah.
do too for that matter, yet
Yeah.
you could see at the time where it could be an out where races could potentially do well
Sure.
separately.
Yeah, I don't mean to be too hard on Lincoln here. To tell you the truth, he is very much in the colonization movement. There were just out and out white supremacists. You know, get blacks out of this country because we hate their guts. Lincoln was never like that. Okay, Lincoln is more of a benign colonizationist in that he says, "Look, my white neighbors are never going to live with black neighbors." He says, "Maybe I don't like that, but that's just the way it is. We're all going to end up killing each other. Let's just separate until we can figure all this out." I mean, I can sympathize. Nevertheless, I think there is some merit to the criticism leveled by Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison and some of the other more radical abolitionists who were saying at the time, "Look, wouldn't your energies have been better spent confronting the white supremacist from the power of the White House and saying, can't you begin to change or at least think about mending your ways?" And towards the end of the war, Lincoln does just that. Towards the very end of the war, he is willing to stand up to white supremacy. I mean, we've got letters written to people that are writing very racist things to him, and you can almost feel him losing patience, saying, "I don't want to hear it anymore. You know, we've crossed the Rubicon now." I think he still toyed with colonization through the war, but not in a public way. I think by 1964, at least, he's made a commitment to try to make this work. You see the evolution of the man. And I think that's the most important thing here. I think towards the end of the war, you see him willing to say to white people, "You can't stay the way you are. Something's got to change here." Because he gets people writing this racist nonsense. And he in the early part of the war, he wouldn't have said a thing. But he writes them back saying, "No, just no, this is wrong."
In private, he was doing that, but not publicly.
Well, I think publicly he was beginning to. I think with those
period.
with those visits of Frederick Douglass, I think we underestimate the power of allowing the most frightening black man in America. And we don't really appreciate how scary Frederick Douglass was to white people back then. He was their bugaboo, man. He was a proud, physically large, imposing, very eloquent, and fairly angry man who has black skin.
Living with a white woman.
Living with a white woman later on, anyway. Yeah, and really scared the living crap out of people. And he brings this man into the White House 3 times. Where no other American president had ever met with a black man other than as their cook prior to that point, even maybe once,
Well, I mean, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say the colonization effort went on decades before that.
Oh, sure did. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's no secret that the capital of Liberia is Monrovia, and the second largest city is Buchanan.
Yeah.
So the capacity for growth in Abraham Lincoln, to me, is always amazing.
Yeah.
The 50s, 1950s, is where we usually talk about that, but also during the Civil War.
Oh, I think so.
He was able to really grow within himself. I mean, of course, we're not the Jefferson Davis bookshop or the Abraham Lincoln bookshop, and we're going to say that. But nonetheless, I think that's a truism.
Oh, yeah.
And he, I think, began to lead the white populace to an extent. He was certainly not leading them. He was conservative. He was, and he was kind of in the middle there.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And as you were certainly pointing out, he was against slavery, but he had some racism in him because of his white skin, and that's
absolutely.
what came up.
Yeah, I say that in my book. I point out that, slavery's not race. They're two different things. And it was entirely common back then to have people who hated slavery and hate black people too. And I make the point in my book. I mean, people who defend Lincoln and point out that he had anti-slavery leanings at this period in time, and he listened to this anti-slavery minister when he was a young man and all that. Sure, that's great. I mean, I think that speaks very well of him. But that doesn't necessarily translate into his views of African Americans, or for that matter, I deal with this Native Americans. What does he think of Indians? And he does carry the what would you call them, the stains of the time. He tells racial jokes that if you were to tell them today, they would be unabashedly racist. He does use the N-word, although not nearly as often as people like Stephen Douglas. He enjoys blackface minstrel shows, things like that. And I hope we will finally get beyond this horrible question that we always seem to ask about him. Whenever I speak about Lincoln, I always get two questions: was he gay? Which I just roll my eyes. We move on. Okay.
Was he a vampire?
Oh no, that's going to be the new one now. No, the other one is, was he racist? It's a bad question. It's just a very bad question, okay? Because it's so simplistic. It makes things way too black and white, literally, maybe figuratively, and it doesn't give you the gray areas,
A question came in. If you email in questions, I hope you'll sign your first name and maybe where you're from. We'd like to know who's doing this. The first question from the same person was the inspiration for your book, Art, but we already talked about that. Very quickly, though, this person asks, clearly you are passionate about these issues. Are you working on other related books of this sort? Just briefly, please.
Yes, I'm working on a book set initially 20 years before, dealing with the most successful slave revolt in American history that almost nobody knows about. Mm-hmm. And I won't tell you what it is. But it then erupts into all these characters. It's got characters from Charles Dickens to Frederick Douglass.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
All in it. Because Frederick Douglass wrote one novel, and he wrote the novel about this episode.
I remember that.
It's really a diplomacy issue.
Yeah.
All right, we'll wait for you to unveil.
And I'm also working on a book on, more related, on 3 politicians, Democrats, who were all lawyers, who were all convicted by military commission, and who were later pardoned or otherwise saved.
Well, talking about lawyers, Norval, one of our regulars, has asked a question. As a New York lawyer and Democratic kingpin, does SLM Barlow play an important role as a lawyer other than a backer of McClellan? Is he involved in any important legal issues? SLM Barlow.
He's just gone far beyond my horizon of knowledge.
Okay. All right. That'll be in the next book, or the supplement to this one.
Yeah, sorry.
So
I
now
do have biographies, by the way. There's a whole appendix of 100 prominent lawyers during the time.
Speaking to that point, there is very little on lawyers per se in the 19th century. I mean, when I wrote my book on Lincoln the Lawyer, I could count the fingers of one hand the number of books that deal with attorneys during this time period. I mean, they're almost, there's very few, and that's why this book's so valuable, and why men like Barlow or whatever, they deserve more attention, because scholars just don't look at them. They really don't. They should.
Here's a question for both of you. Some years ago, the Supreme Court held a symposium on the legality of secession. What did the Constitution say about secession? And they finally devolved down to that it was open. The Constitution did come down on one side or the other. And to me, it was going to be that war, and I think to Lincoln as well, by the way, war was going to decide that issue. So, what are your thoughts on secession and the legality of it, and whether, like a libertarian, Lincoln should have let the South go? William Safire was ready to do that in his Lincoln book.
There are a couple of points, I think. In November 1860, President Buchanan asked the Attorney General for an opinion on, if there is a secession, what is the authority of the President to stop it? So we have that document, which then got converted into Buchanan's message to the Congress a month later.
The rope of sand thing.
And basically, he says, both of them say, the President has full power and responsibility to enforce and execute the law, but can take only defensive positions. And it's up to Congress to deal with things beyond that. But as a general proposition, when you get married, you don't talk about divorce. So the Constitution talks about this is how we get together, and not about how we separate. The EU, the European Union, today, when they got together, there's nothing about how you separate.
Maybe they should have talked about that.
Well, separation, secession was big in New England at the time of the Louisiana Purchase because they thought that was going to shift the political power away from them. We ought to secede. It was talked about in New England with the Hartford Convention during the War of 1812, where the New England maritime interests said, hey, you guys are screwing up our economy, we're going to leave. And so it was a northern idea. Never happened. And then you had
was trying to get us here, the old Northwest, to secede against the East.
Sure. So it was talked about, and it was Jackson who really stopped the secession effort in South Carolina at a time before you had a telegraph. So South Carolina couldn't get everybody together. And as I recall, I think this is in your book, when Lincoln came to Washington, he asked his former partner, I want 3 documents, send them to me.
Yeah.
The Constitution, Clay's defense of the Compromise of 1850, and most important, Jackson's proclamation on the secession of the purported secession of South Carolina. The only modern thoughtful review of secession was done in Canada. The Supreme Court of Canada in 1998 dealt with the Quebec issue. And it's a wonderful decision to talk about. And they said basically, sorry, this is not the way to do it.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's a point. There's a little noticed section of Lincoln's first inaugural address that very few people seem to look at. But it's really interesting because Lincoln addresses this question of, is secession never possible? And he says in that speech, he says, and it takes him a while to get to it, and you have to kind of dig in. He says, you could secede if you called a convention of everybody in the Union together, and then after everybody deliberated, then it was agreed that separation was best. But he said you can't just take one piece of the puzzle and pull it out. Everybody has to get together and agree this is so. So I think that kind of gives Lincoln's answer to the whole secession issue. He really did believe that there had been created an aggregate American community of a singular community. He says 1776. You could argue 1787. He's kind of fuzzy about that, but he says there is one community. You can't break that up unless they all come together again. So there is a scenario in which Lincoln says you could have secession. You would just simply have to have everybody agree that it was the right thing to do.
He was talking like a contract lawyer.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he
Consideration.
was saying, but he was in effect answering 4 days after South Carolina seceded, their declaration of secession. The same convention passed a statement. I forgot what they call it, our statement of grievances.
Yeah.
Which explained why we were seceding.
Right.
And you had a contract theory. We had a compact. Our Constitution. You guys violated it. Because you won't return our slaves. And the Constitution said you've got to return them. So you broke the contract, and that gives us. Now Lincoln says basically, this is not a bilateral contract, it's a multilateral contract. And you may be right, maybe some guys did violate part of it, but when you have a multilateral contract, all the parties have to agree. So it's just marvelous to have these two contract lawyers debating each other.
It's funny how nobody notices that, though. You rarely see someone talk about Lincoln kind of saying you could secede if you had the right circumstances, but nobody seems to notice that much.
Well, you had in the Declaration of Independence the right of revolution.
Exactly,
Which the South
Which I
also
think
played.
made Lincoln very nervous, and it's one of the reasons why he didn't refer to the Declaration of Independence ever during the war. Have you ever noticed? I mean, right from about the time that they raised that flag in front of Philadelphia on the way to the inaugural, he mentions the Declaration, twice after that, where he talked about like 50 times in the 1850s. I think it made him nervous, because there's some things in the Declaration that aren't too handy for him if he's trying to fight a secession movement.
And the South sung that song repeatedly.
God, yes.
Declaration of Independence. We have as much right to secede as the colonies had to secede from King George.